It's time for Branding Business, the only show that brings branding experts and corporate executives together to explore how branding your business can improve both your top-line growth and bottom-line performance. Brought to you by RiechesBaird. And now here's your host.
Welcome to Branding Business with RiechesBaird. My name is Alan Brew, and our special guest today is David Aaker, Professor Emeritus of Marketing Strategy at the Haas School of Business, University of Berkeley. And as listeners probably know, David Aaker is considered to be one of the leading gurus on branding. He is the author of numerous books on the subject, and his latest is entitled Brand Relevance, Making Competitors Irrelevant, in which he focuses on the critical role of innovation in maintaining brand leadership. David, welcome to Branding Business.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. So, David, very intriguing title of the book. Traditionally, companies have spent a lot of money trying to establish a preference for their brands. It's the my brand is better than your brand approach. What's wrong with this approach?
It just doesn't work. It's quite amazing. You can look at categories after categories and realize that brand preference competition rarely does anything. I was talking just last week to a fellow that was head of the detergent business at Procter & Gamble, and he used to say, if we can move the market share up a tenth of 1%, we had a good quarter. I studied the beer market in Japan over 50 years, and only 4 times did the market share trajectory change. And 3 of those times there was a new subcategory introduced, dry beer or Ichiban or Hapashu, and the 4th time a category was repositioned. So all that money that's spent on marketing during those 50 years, all those new products, they just did nothing. And in category after category, you see the same thing. It's only when there is innovation that creates what I call must-haves, customers must have, only then do you see really any changes. Again, you can look at any category and the same pattern emerges. So this brand preference competition is often necessary and justifiable, but it doesn't change anything.
Right. That's a very incremental approach to brand building. And you mentioned innovation and subcategories. What exactly do you mean by subcategories, David?
Well, the subcategory is defined as something that has a must-have. It's not an innovation that involves a nice-to-have. It's actually a must-have. So you have mini computers or network workstations or graphic workstations or build-to-order PCs. Those are all sort of really dramatic innovations in the computer space that created must-haves and that customers really didn't want anymore, something that didn't have that. And so they all created a strong niche. And the implication is that when you do perturb the market like that and create a new subcategory, there's the old competitors are not going to be relevant anymore because they're not going to have the visibility and credibility in this new market space.
So I see. So you in effect just leapfrog the competition with this new subcategory.
Well, it's not so much leapfrogging the competition because that means you kind of do what they did but do it better. So what you're doing is doing something so that they're not relevant anymore. I mean, Cirque du Soleil doesn't worry about Barnum and Bailey because they're not relevant for what Cirque du Soleil does, and you know the graphic workstation people weren't concerned with the mainstream computers back in the 80s because they just weren't relevant for what what they're making. So it's more than leapfrogging. You might call it leapfrogging, but I think it's more like you're creating a whole new competitive battlefield for which competitors are not relevant.
Exactly. That's a very interesting way of looking at it. So can you give me any examples, David? You mentioned the beer category in Japan. Is that a good example of where innovation has disrupted the market?
Yeah, it is. But in every area there are examples, a lot of examples usually of how an innovation has come in. Take the automobile industry. In Chrysler in 1982 came out with a minivan. It was done by Aaker, who was a few years before fired by Ford. He was running a company then that was bankrupt, that was bailed out by the government, and it was penniless, making bad products. And he put $2/3 of $1 billion into this minivan idea, and what happened was he sold 200,000 of them the first year. He sold 12 or 13 million so far, and he went 16 years with no competition. No competition, none. There was no viable alternative to the Chrysler minivan for 16 years. You look at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, they've gone 40 or 50 years with no viable competition. It's only in the last 3 or 4 years where people have tried to compete with their sort of must-have, which is a rent-a-car service for people whose cars are being fixed. So in both cases, there are just huge payoffs to this ability to create a new subcategory and then create barriers to competition, so they wouldn't enter.
You mentioned Lee Iacocca, who himself was a fairly high-profile personality. What does it take to create a subcategory? Does it take an individual with a unique point of view, or a maverick like Lee Iacocca, or can any company do this?
It's a great question, because when you come to there's a lot of support within the organization, strategically and financially, for incremental innovations to make it a little better than last year. But when it comes to disruptive, substantial, or transformational innovations, the political support within the organization is pretty weak, because you're taking money away from these big business units that want to do what they did last year. So there's a lot of organizational and personal inhibitions against taking big risks and going for the big innovation. And so one way to overcome those risks is to have a strong CEO that's a believer, that believes that strategically it's necessary to put some of your resources behind the big innovation. And Lee Iacocca, Steve Jobs, and people like that are definitely one way to get around it. But some organizations are able to, innovate in a strategic, major way without such a CEO. But definitely a CEO is a big asset. I mean, Steve Jobs did it 5 times in 10 years. It was one of the most amazing organizational accomplishments of maybe all time.
So tell me more about that, David. What did Steve Jobs do that was so remarkable?
Well, he created subcategories again and again over a period of 10 or 15 years. I mean, not even counting Pixar, not even counting the iMac. He did the iPod, the iTunes, the iPad, the Apple stores, and the iPhone. I mean, that's 5 of them. And within a decade, it was truly remarkable. In each case, he went into an established industry, created a whole new subcategory with some strong must-haves and some strong barriers to competition. So it was really extraordinary. And I write a a blog called davidaaker.com, and one of my entries I tried to analyze what made Steve Jobs so successful, even though he was such a jerk with respect to his employees. And I compared his management style to Bobby Knight, the fabled coach of the Indiana basketball team, who also had a very disagreeable management style. And it's very interesting to ask that question. Why was Jobs so successful when he was such a harsh, superior?
Just thinking of our listeners, David. I mean, Steve Jobs is a one-off, and so is Bobby Knight and Lee Iacocca. I mean, how could our listeners who are running the typical business introduce this spirit of innovation in a disruptive way to emulate, Steve Jobs and the rest?
Well, I think the one thing that it requires is a strategic vision for what is needed and what is possible in the marketplace. The second thing is that it has to be a firm-wide resource allocation. So there has to be resources that support this major innovation because there's plenty of political support for the incremental innovation. And so that's another factor that's, I think, really important. And third, it needs to be kind of supported with with the kinds of inputs that generate really good, ideas for major innovation. That has to come from the marketplace by being close to the customer and to their needs and wants and unmet needs, but also close to technology and what's possible. I mean, that was certainly a major part of the genius of Steve Jobs. So there's a lot of things you can do to make innovation, more feasible in your organization. But I think directionally, you have to realize you have to shift resources of at least some resources from incremental to major innovation.
And especially if you're a public company and you're required to meet quarterly results and deliver your guidance, it really is a very difficult balancing act, I should imagine, for CEOs of those kind of companies who have to build on the past to find a way forward. And at the same time, think beyond it.
In this blog I mentioned, davidaaker.com, my last entry was, why do organizations not support big ideas? And your instinct was it's a problem.
So what can we tell them? I mean, how do we? Is it a question of corporate culture? How do we get that kind of innovative, the freedom to fail sort of factor?
Yeah, it is part of the corporate culture. It's the nature of the CEO. It's the nature of the employees. But I think that the most important thing is to have a good budget allocation thing and to recognize the biases against major innovation, and to see if they can be, counteracted when they are made visible.
Is there any company out there today who catches your attention in terms of doing something interesting in this area?
Well, I think, of course, Apple is right, but I think that Procter & Gamble is also has some good systems. One of the things that they do is to look externally for innovation. They've made it a goal to have 50% of their innovations come from outside Procter & Gamble, so they don't rely on their internal R&D operation. And a lot of their major innovations in the last 5 years have come from outside Procter & Gamble, sometimes from competitors, actually. And so I think Procter & Gamble is always on the forefront of, I think, innovation and brand management. 3M is another good one. 3M is always had a practice of getting their different silo organizations to work together and to to take an innovation in one area and apply it in another. And so they've, over many, many decades, have been able to come out with new innovations. And I wrote a book called Spanning Silos, indicating that silos not talking to each other is a big problem in branding for a lot of reasons, but it also inhibits major innovation, because all these big silos want to engage in incremental innovation and to be a little better than last year in terms of doing what they do. And so 3M is one of the rare companies that have really overcome the silo problem, and its ability to inhibit innovation.
Right. A great example, 3M and also Procter & Gamble, who have for a long time looked at ways of innovating. And also I noticed that Pepsi, too, is trying to find ways forward in the beverage category beyond their sodas and sugared drinks.
But I should say that very small companies often have an advantage in innovating because they have less to use. They're looking for a way to avoid competing with the really big guys, so they're trying to find new niches. And a lot of times, well, I don't know what the percentage is, but 80% of the time, the innovation doesn't come from the large established companies. It comes from outside, a small guy that has an idea that is able to leverage it and stay under the radar until they get big and have developed barriers. So this whole idea of creating new subcategories is even more important for the small business.
And you see so many small businesses being acquired by the large ones, I should imagine, simply to access this innovative platform or technology they've come up with. Yeah,
Clorox is sort of famous or infamous for never in its whole history being able to innovate internally, but they're very good at buying small innovative companies and then scaling them. And there's a lot of big companies that take this. Coca-Cola turned its back on water for decades to its detriment, but then they bought a lot of water and juice companies and tried to scale them as a way to come to the party.
As you talk, David, I can't help thinking of Kodak, our late lamented Kodak. How does a brand avoid becoming irrelevant, like Kodak?
Well, good question. It's all about. There's two ways of becoming irrelevant. One is you're no longer making what they're buying. The second is you lose visibility and credibility. And with respect to the latter, every brand needs to have more energy. It needs to be more visible. And we've had data that show that brands globally are declining in equity, and the exception are those with energy. So every brand needs energy. You either have to have energy through new products, or you have to find something with energy and attach yourself to it, like the Avon March for Breast Cancer or Pampers baby care program or something like that. Now, the other way is that you stop making what they're buying. So if you're a fast food franchise and people are starting to buy healthy foods, then you have to make a decision. You have to either keep doing what you're doing better and hope there's a cadre of people that aren't going to be marching off to this healthy thing, or you can put healthy stuff into your menu and try to be acceptable to the people that are interested in healthy foods. So, or you can diversify and stop opening, unhealthy restaurants. Start opening healthy restaurants, and like Starbucks is now starting to open this Evolution, whatever it is, restaurant, which is going to be juices and vegetables and so forth. That's going to be healthy for you. They're going to have a whole new growth pattern. So those are kind of three ways you can try to adapt. into this to deal with the problem that they're not buying what I'm making anymore. One of the most interesting things, the young people in our country don't buy cars anymore, or they're buying much less than before. So the whole car industry has a relevance problem with respect to the people in their 20s. And so what they're doing to address that is quite interesting, but it's a difficult problem.
People in their 20s, how are they? Are they just avoiding cars, or finding other means of transport, or are they just averse to buying them?
Cars is the ultimate self-expressive purchase, and the people in the 20s aren't after self-expressive benefits anymore. And they're more interested in the internet and computer games and so on. And there's the zip car business where you borrow a car instead of buy one is appealing to those people in their 20s. And a lot of them live in urban areas where there's mass transit, and they just use that or bicycle. And it's just harder to capture their imagination. Like in the old days, the VW Bug or the Pontiac, muscle machine, or the Mazda Miata would or the Cube, the Nissan Cube would capture the attention. But that's getting harder and harder.
Well, so the whole car industry has a relevance problem when it comes to the 20-somethings who are simply no longer interested in finding a way of expressing themselves through.
Exactly. That's been true in Japan for 10 years. It's a horrible problem in Japan, and now it's reached the States.
So what are they doing about it? How are they finding ways to appeal to these people who are disaffected by the whole notion of a car?
Well, what they're doing is they're trying to find some magic brand that will appeal to them, like the hybrid category or something. It has got some potential in terms of creating some interest and loyalty. The Prius does well in that segment, and then there's the Cube, and Ford has a product, and Chevy has a product that's absolutely aimed at the 20s, and it tends to be a little more utilitarian rather than sexy.
Right. I know whether Chevy and Ford are the brands to do it with. They seem to be very 20th century for people.
Well,
in their 20s.
It is. It's a lot of the brands that are doing the best with the 20s are foreign brands.
Mm. Well, that's remarkable. So it's visibility, energy, and the overall goal is not to be the best, but the only one doing what you're doing.
Yes, it's a whole new way of looking at it. Instead of my brand's better than your brand, we want to be the only brand that does what we do.
Well, that's quite a challenge. David...
well, it's also quite an opportunity.
Any last thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with on this subject?
No, I guess not. Again, if they want more of my week-to-week thoughts, I'm on davidaker.com, and I'm associated with Profit, a company that does brand and marketing consulting, making competitors irrelevant.
Right. And you can find us, of course, at brandingbusiness.com. Thanks once again for listening.
You've been listening to Branding Business, the only show that brings branding experts and corporate executives together to explore how branding your business can improve both your top-line growth and bottom-line performance. To hear more, simply visit our website, brandingbusiness.com, or tune in next week to learn how you too can build your brand and move your business forward. Brought to you by RiechesBaird.